They went each to his own house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. And early in the morning he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, "Rabbi, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such. What do you say about her?" This they said to test him, so that they might have some charge to bring against him. But Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to cast a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. But when they heard it, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the eldest, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. And he looked up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more," which is John 7:53 to 8:11, if you're keeping score. This morning I wanted to expand something I mentioned almost as an aside a couple of messages ago, the so-called pericope adulterae, which is Latin for the passage about the adulterous woman. This is a passage with a very interesting textual history. It doesn't appear in any of the surviving Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, at least of the Gospel of John, until the 5th century. And no Greek commentator on John mentions the story for 1,000 years after Jesus. On the other hand, it does appear in the Old Latin versions of the Gospels, which are earlier than Jerome's Vulgate translation, which came out at the end of the 4th century, and in the Vulgate itself, where it appears in the same location we have it, John 7:53 to 8:11. There are allusions to this story, or at least a similar one, all the way back into the 2nd century. And the earliest Greek manuscript that does contain the story, the Codex Bezae, has similarities to the so-called Western text family of New Testament manuscripts, and as a group, they go back into the 2nd century. Furthermore, at the turn of the 5th century, Augustine says that this passage was being cut out of the Gospels by some people because they thought it gave the impression that Jesus was soft on sin, particularly adultery, and they didn't want Jesus to be seen as giving permission for people to behave badly. The story itself is probably genuine. It just wasn't part of John originally. The passage moves around in the manuscripts, and how many times have you heard me say, that's usually a bad sign? But where it does seem to have come from is Luke. It doesn't sound anything like the rest of John, but it does sound like Luke. Beyond that, John 7:53 to 8:2 is essentially a doublet of Luke 21:37 to 38, and that's probably where the story belongs. John 7:53 to 8:2 is, they went each to his own house, but Jesus went out to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple, and he sat down, and all the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. Luke 21:37 to 38. And every day he was teaching in the temple, but at night he went out and lodged at the mount called Olivet, and early in the morning all the people came to him in the temple to hear him. In its present location in John, the woman taken in adultery incident interrupts a dialogue, right in the middle. But if you follow some of the manuscripts and move the story back to Luke, things make a lot more sense. We can even give the story a date. The time would probably have been either on the Tuesday morning or the Wednesday morning after the triumphal entry on Palm Sunday, but before the Last Supper on Thursday and the crucifixion on Good Friday. Immediately before where this story would fit in Luke, Luke has the triumphal entry followed by 1 or 2 days worth of Jesus teaching in the temple, including the story of the widow's mite and the discourse on the end of days. Immediately after the place where this story would fit, Luke 22 begins with Jesus noting to the disciples that Passover starts in 2 days, that is on Thursday night, which is followed by Judas's agreement to betray Jesus. The episode itself seems to describe a spontaneous mob action. A crowd is dragging a woman to Jesus in order to get his sanction for what we would probably call an honor killing. The leaders of the mob, or those who had insinuated themselves into leadership over the mob, were trying to trap Jesus in the run-up to the Passover. Their problem was that Jesus just wasn't into violence against women, and he probably got that from, of all people, Joseph. Somehow Joseph is never given enough credit for his role in raising the children. It's quite instructive to have a glance at the letter of James. James isn't concerned with orthodoxy, right belief, so much as with orthopraxy, right practice, right action. Just like the Sermon on the Mount, and many branches of Quakerism come to that. That may indicate that despite the fact that Martin Luther famously disliked the letter of James enough to want to remove it from the New Testament altogether, he called it an epistle of straw, it might actually preserve a core which does go back to the brother of Jesus, even though its current form clearly doesn't. It's my belief that the sort of pragmatic spirituality that you find in James is due at least as much to Joseph as it is to Mary, and possibly more so. One of the parts of the nativity story, which is often glossed over, is how when Joseph found out that his fiancée was pregnant with a child that wasn't his, he considered not marrying her. But he was unwilling to make Mary a public example. That was a euphemism for Mary's execution by stoning, in accordance with one of the laws in Deuteronomy. In case you're wondering, no, pregnancy would not have saved Mary's life until after she had given birth. In Jewish tradition, life begins when the baby takes its first breath and not before. The presumption of Jewish law was that because Mary was in a town, Nazareth, according to Luke, she must have consented to what happened because nobody heard her scream for help. If she'd been attacked out in the country, the presumption would have been that she screamed and fought back as best she could, but nobody was there to hear her or help her. In case you are keeping score, that law is found in Deuteronomy 22, 23 to 27. So what did Joseph end up doing? He married the girl, of course, and raised the kid. And it's very tempting to see the influence of the man who married Mary because he didn't want to see her killed, and who raised Jesus and James in the Sermon on the Mount, in today's story, and in the book of James. At any rate, the crowd drags this woman whom they accuse of having been caught in the act of adultery in front of Jesus. The seventh commandment's prohibition of adultery is well known, but there's also Deuteronomy 22:22, which makes adultery a capital crime punished by stoning. Both of the guilty parties were to be executed, and many sermons have made a point of raising the feminist question, where was the man? Not only was he apparently not there, he's never even mentioned. What gives? Interestingly enough, there's one case in the Torah which might correspond to the situation behind this story. Immediately before the commandment that mandates the death penalty for both partners in cases of adultery, there's a passage dealing with the situation in which a man suspects that the wife he's married wasn't a virgin on their wedding night. He's allowed to approach his in-laws for proof. In the event that his in-laws can't produce their daughter's tokens of virginity, either the bloody wedding dress or the bloody sheets from the wedding night, the man's wife is to be taken to the door of her father's house and stoned to death by the men of the city. The reason? She has dishonored her father's house by playing the harlot there. This may well be what lies behind the story of Jesus and the adulterous woman. The crowd claims that the woman has been caught in the act of adultery. The Greek expression they use, ep autophoro moikiomene, is usually translated as caught in the very act of something, or caught red-handed. It's usually taken to mean that the woman had literally been dragged away from the bed while the rumpled sheets were still warm. But that might not be what happened here. It's possible that the original situation referred to a new bride who had just failed one of these virginity tests, which would certainly explain why the woman's partner in sin is not only never seen, but never even mentioned. The woman's accusers didn't have to produce the man involved. As for the woman, her presumed offense might very well have paralleled Mary's situation before Jesus' own birth. A modern equivalent would be a person's attitude toward abortion if he or she might never have been born if abortion had been legal at the time. Whatever position the person might take on the issue is bound to be colored by the person's own background. As I noted earlier, Jesus' opponents would have been seeking a way to trap him. So the choice they gave him was essentially the same one Mordred gives King Arthur in the musical Camelot. Kill the woman or kill the law. Trouble with the Romans or trouble with the crowd. A perfect choice, at least for Jesus' enemies. Jesus, however, refuses to take the bait. What he does, instead of answering immediately, is to stoop and write on the ground. Now, it isn't entirely clear that Jesus could read and write. If not, then the Greek should be translated that Jesus drew or doodled on the ground rather than wrote. But there are hints that he possibly was literate. The strongest of these hints is the ancient traditions associating Mary's lineage with priests. Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, is said to be both Mary's cousin and one of the daughters of Aaron, that is, from a priestly family. As for what Jesus wrote, the story doesn't say. But after Jesus delivers the famous line about the man without sin being the first to cast a stone at her, it was enough to make the woman's accusers slink away ashamed. From the oldest to the youngest, leaving the two of them, Jesus and the woman, alone. Now, this story is often pitched as a story of forgiveness, and it is that certainly. But look at it for a moment. Jesus never asks the woman if she was actually guilty. If I'm correct, and it was a question of her having failed one of those virginity tests, she might not have been guilty of actually doing anything at all. There are medical reasons why a woman might have been unable to pass a suspicious husband's virginity test. Jesus also never asks her about how she came to be there with him. What he does, instead, is simply tell her that he doesn't condemn her either and not to sin anymore. He imposes no sacrifices, no elaborate rituals, and has only one condition for her. Essentially, just go and keep your nose clean. But beyond this story just being about forgiveness, there's another meaning. You have to meet people where they are. Not where you want them to be, and not where you think they should be, but where they actually are. You have to discern clearly the people they are. It's rather like Michelangelo talking about sculpture being the process of liberating the figures trapped inside the marble. And when he succeeded in doing this, the results were magnificent. But what people don't remember most of the time is that at his death, he left some of these figures unfinished. He was never able to set all of the figures and the pieces of marble that he started working on free. It also takes spiritual honesty. We all heard my friend Kim Williams last week when he mentioned the degree of spiritual honesty he's found among people who are actually working the 12 steps. Why do you think God told Moses that the divine name was Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh? I am who or what I am. In order to live into the image of God in which we are all created, we have to be spiritually honest with God, with each other, and above all, with ourselves. In the words of the old song, take a look at yourself and you can look at others differently. And once you do that, you're able to grow in grace and help others do the same. Amen. Up.